Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, it is my turn. I picked a story called The Black Phone by Joe Hill. I came across it because I'm continuing my trend of looking up short stories that have been made into films.
Yes, it's working out.
It's working out really well, I think. Maybe it's like working out hopefully too for, people discovering the podcast or like caring about the short story. That's really why I'm doing it. At first it was like hard to come up with stories to find, but now that I'm doing this, it's like, yeah, let's revisit the original. It's always better. I came across this one. It just came out in theaters, I guess. So I thought it was like forthcoming. I think it was at the time that I came across it, but that was a couple weeks ago. So
Yeah, by the time this episode comes out,
it'll be out in
out of the theaters, people have forgotten about it.
By the time it's out, you'll find it on Netflix or something. But yeah, okay. Finney glanced up, had time to see Al holding a steel can, yellow and black, with pictures of wasps on it. He was shaking it furiously. Finney began to smile, had the wild idea that Al was about to spray him with silly string. The part-time clown hit him in the face with a blast of white foam. Finney started to turn his head away, but was too slow to avoid getting it in his eyes. He screamed and took some in the mouth, tasted something harsh and chemical. His eyes were coals, cooking in their sockets. His throat burned. In his entire life, he had never felt any pain like it, a searing, icy heat. His stomach heaved, and the grape soda came back up in a hot, sweet rush. Al had him by the back of the neck and was pulling him forward into the van. Finney's eyes were open, but all he could see were the pulsations of orange and oily brown that flared, dripped, ran into one another and faded. The fat man had a fistful of his hair and another hand between his legs, scooping him up by the crotch. The inside of Al's arm brushed his cheek. Finney turned his head and bit down on a mouthful of wobbling fat, squeezed until he tasted blood. The fat man wailed and let go, and for a moment, Finney had his feet on the ground again. He stepped back and put his heel on an orange. His ankle folded. He tottered, almost fell, and then the fat man had him by the neck again. He shoved him forward. Finney hit one of the van's rear doors head first with a low bonging sound, and all the strength went out of his legs. Albert had an arm under his chest, tipped him forward into a coal chute, then he let go, and Finney dropped with a horrifying velocity into darkness. Do you know who this writer is?
Yes.
Okay, well, I forgot. It's Stephen King's son.
Yeah. One of them. One of the elder,
Yes.
I think.
Doesn't just one of them, right?
I thought they both did.
Did they? The fact that we don't know is bothering one, if not both of them. Yeah. But yes, this is one of the sons. And I feel like one of them is more prolific than the other one, or I don't know. But obviously, like when you're reading this, it is so Stephen King.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
The clown, the boys getting kidnapped by the clown, the whole Stephen King, I talk about it every time I talk about it because I don't have like anything else to reference, but like all of his cast of characters and like all the time periods and all like the feelings of like a ragtag bunch of boys that are always the heroes, because they're always wise to what is actually happening and the victim of whatever it is. And the adults are not, like the adults are nowhere to be found. So even in this story, when Finney, who's kidnapped by this clown, he knows everything about this clown in terms of like what he's done to other kids. Like he knows that other kids have disappeared and that it's like this guy or whoever it was. Maybe it wasn't the clown every time, whatever, but like he knows that he's probably going to die. And then he starts getting these like visions in the basement from the other kids. So he knows that like the phone is always a thing. The phone always rings and like he's going to be in there for a couple days, blah, blah, blah. But even as he like envisions being saved, he's picturing like his sister. He's not picturing like a parent figure, the cops, anyone. Like that is so Stephen King. It's probably the only takeaway I have, which is like when kids turn on authority and band together, it makes for like a wonderful coming of youth. When the kids are the heroes, that has a certain feel to it. So that was all like so Stephen King. It was so Stephen King. But I like this because it was short. And I think it's definitely a memorable story. They're turning it into a movie, which this story takes place in one room. Like there's a scene at the beginning where he's captured, but then the rest of it is like he's in this basement. And anything else is flashback or like a hallucination, So there's like room to move. But it is like a kind of short, contained piece. So I wonder what the film will look like. And I feel like they're probably only making it a film because it's a King writer, It's Joe Hill. what was fun about this though, and I don't necessarily have tons to say about it. I just feel like like a lot of Stephen King's horror is like as close as you can get to like a jump scare on the page. So we've talked about other horror stories in short fiction format and how they're less jump scare than they are, like tension and stress and like just weird stuff. But you can't like make me jump when I'm reading it, right? Like you get a different thrill from horror on the page versus horror in a theater. So it is always like interesting to look at whatever you can come across that's like, this is going to be a jump scare on film. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there will be moments.
There's this one spot where he's like picked up the phone in the basement. And he dialed for the operator, and the receiver went click, click, click in his ear, but there was no ring on the other end, no connection. Then all of a sudden, quote marks in the next line. "It doesn't work," Al said. "It hasn't worked since I was a kid." That's like the literary textual equivalent of a jump scare, because Al has not been introduced to the scene in any other way until he starts talking, right? So you're like, oh, who's talking? Oh, it's Al. Okay.
Yeah. And even then, like, I mean, it's more disorienting than it is shocking,
Because you're reading it. You see the quote marks and you're like, oh, wait, someone's talking?
Yeah.
He was alone in the room, so who's saying that? Then the name happens after,
right?
And like our eyes like skip ahead and skip back and like skip all over the page while they're reading.
I know there's so many things that are happening where you're like your brain is cheating you out of
That's right.
the traditional horror experience. Yeah. So my only like thought to comment on why this works is because even though it's maybe like defined as a horror, what's done really well here is like all the action. There's a couple of those scenes where like Finney's gonna make a break for it. He's going to try something. He's going to have that encounter at the end with the brother and then with Al, the final struggle here. Like, spoiler, he survives. But stuff like that is where I think you can tell that Stephen and Joe are good writers. It's almost like, I'm sure I've talked about this with Stephen King's writing. It's like the less you're noticing the language itself, the more you should probably admit that it is really, really good writing. So there's writing where like you're reading it and you're underlining every word and sentence because it's like poetry. You're like, that was gorgeous. Like, I am paying attention to the syntax and like, I love it. Like, I love this. It's beautiful, beautiful. I have books like that where you're circling sentiments or lines of dialogue and just like powerful. And then there's stuff like this by writers like this that you're just zinging through. And that is equally skilled writing. It's just for a totally different purpose.
You talked about the action and like, part of the zipping through, I think, is like that jump scare section I pointed out before, but on page 14 at the bottom. So he's looking up and he sees this window, right? Long glass. There were two little windows, long glass slots set high in the wall, well out of easy reach, emitting some faint weed green light. Rusty grills had been bolted across them. Finney studied one of the windows for a long time, then ran at the wall, didn't give himself time to think how drained and sick he was, planted a foot against the plaster and leaped. For one moment he grabbed the grill, but the steel links were too close together to squeeze a finger in, and he dropped back to his heels, then fell on his rear, shivering violently. There's no internal deliberation.
Yes.
It just says he's studying one of the windows for a long time.
What a good point. Yeah. Okay.
You don't get anything internal like in his mind. You just see him from the outside, and it's like watching a movie. Like suddenly he's running at the wall. You're like, what's he doing? I don't know. Right. And then you see, until you see it all play out, you don't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
That's one of those, like, I think that could be, you can use that as a trick. That's a bit of like how to write certain kinds of scenes to get that effect, right?
Yeah.
Is to not go into their head for that. And you get in his head in other places. So it's not like this point of view doesn't go in his head. It's just for that moment, you don't need to.
You don't need it. Yeah, that's a great point. Like maybe if you've been criticized for having like clunky writing or writing that it's difficult to picture, maybe that's what you're doing too much of, like taking them out of the scene by like putting them back in someone's head.
That could absolutely do it. Yeah, because then you're looking at two different things.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, I mean, like back to my point, like the reason it's well done, you can recognize it as being well done, is because you can picture it all, and so you're able to picture it all because you're not being interrupted by, like you said, jumping in and out of the character's head. Like this is pure action. This is pure stage notes, like this is how it would maybe be written in like a screenplay. Like he dips back, he grabs him here, like if you wanted to give these actors notes
on a stage play, it'd be like they fight.
But you know what I mean? Like
you get the choreographer to come in and like make something up.
yeah, whatever. So the whoever's like actually doing like the blocking for this would, whatever you call it. Yeah, so there's sections like that which are good. And then like I think the rest of the story is like pretty straightforward. It's almost like it's a good formula, you know? Like he runs into a clown, which is interesting enough. And then he gets kidnapped right away. First section. We don't have this bizarre buildup. Just show us the action, show us like the inciting incident, which is him getting kidnapped. And then the second section, and it's numbered too, which we've talked about probably, at least like I've talked about it in our workshop. I feel like when you break a story into sections, it's like so much easier for you to picture it, you know? It comes across as this like skilled thing where you've broken it up and paused somewhere, but it's also really great to help you storyboard. It's like end scene, and it gives you like permission to start somewhere else. You don't have to have this transition. So he goes down a dark chute, and then the second one is the second section just starts. And it says a door banged open. So you don't necessarily like, you know, time has passed because we know that the clown has him in his car and is taking him somewhere. But we don't have to see all that. He doesn't have to show us all that. We don't have to bother, you know. You could have shown us that, but he didn't want to maybe. And this way he just appears in the basement next. And then the next section, this is my only edit on this story, which is so stupid and so minor because who cares? But the very first sentence of section 3, it says he didn't know what Al was going to say when he came back, but he didn't need to explain anything. Finney already knew all about it. I would have put that at the end of section 2, because in the beginning of section 3 could just start the first child to disappear. And that accomplishes what I'm talking about, which is like giving you permission to just jump into something. So section 3 just like jumps into backstory. So he could have started this story and said like the first child to disappear. He could have started with this section. But then we know that Finney's going to get captured. Who cares? And we also don't need to know that Finney knows that kids have been captured as he's being captured, because that it's told so quickly. He's fighting for his life in the moment. It makes sense to introduce the backstory when he has time to actually sit and think and reflect on it. So that's another like takeaway, right? Like a lot of times when we have stories by writers who are like so stressed about, well, I got to tell you about what happened that led up to this, they don't know when to insert it, right? We always say like, try to find a way that like it naturally arises, you know, like in conversation with another character where they see something and it reminds them of something else. This is a perfect example of like when to insert backstory, which is like when he's literally sitting in a cell waiting and he's reflecting on this exact scenario. So this is when you give it.
I think that paragraph, you're right. The break could come after that paragraph.
Yeah.
I think the reason it doesn't, or a reason maybe, kind of defend why it's there.
Yeah, sure.
Would be that I like the ending of the previous section better, where it did leave off.
So then why not delete the line altogether?
Maybe that could be a solution too. But I think you're right. I mean, you can, because you're breaking in sections. You don't need to like lead us into it. But you were talking about like when to insert background. And this story follows the exact same kind of structure that we talked about in a couple of other stories over time. And I think we kind of talked about it in that Lady Tigers story.
Yeah.
And then we talked about it in that Dale Bailey Snow story. Yeah. But it's like you start off with some sort of action, some sort of thing, like the current moment, and then you dive into backstory, and then you come back to the current moment. Since we pointed that out in whichever episode, so many stories I've read have followed that exact formula, that exact structure. Even flash fiction can sometimes fall into that structure. It's kind of amazing that once you notice that, it's like everywhere, but it's like current action, that the current action being also where the drama is. Like you start with the drama, go to backstory to kind of bring us up to speed, and then come back to the drama.
Right.
And this story does that. It's like start with the drama. He's being kidnapped. Backstory. Where did this kidnapper go? What's been going on? Why does he, what does he know? Come back to the drama of he's been kidnapped. So you can take that out of horror as a genre, out of any other, you put it into any kind of situation.
It just works.
You have a structure that works.
Yeah. Once you kind of know that, it feels like cheating, because it really does remove a lot of the guesswork. It removes a lot of what you've otherwise told yourself is like the creative process of deciding when to do this. Like the reason like formulas like that are so successful and so common is because like they just work. Like why would you continue to reinvent this in a confusing way? Like this is the way that at least in the 21st century, like we expect this information to be given to us. One
problem is if I can offer any kind of advice,
realizing
that don't think about it when you're reading too much because it'll get monotonous.
Sure.
But the other thing is reading this, when I reread it, I was like, how are they going to put this as a movie? Because this is really short. Like, I don't know how you make this into a movie. Like, I'm just trying to imagine, do you start with the backstory? Do you start like with earlier kidnappings and kind of like build this? Because one of the cool things he does is on page 2, he's watching this guy struggle at the back of the van. And this is the guy that's going to wind up killing him or kidnapping him. And he says, what happened next was such a perfect bit of slapstick. It might have been practiced. And only later did it occur to Finney that probably it had been. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. Yeah. You think about it, you have this inference of menace, right? You're like, right. Oh, okay. If this is something that later Finney thought would probably practiced, that means that it led to something that's worth talking about. So when you translate that into a movie, you can introduce menace in a bunch of different ways, like with the visual medium, like just color scheme, kind of just like music, all kinds of things can help introduce that menace. Like in the story, you need just the words and the way that things are presented.
Right.
So anyway, it just makes me think about how this could be restructured to be a movie. I don't think it would work with its current structure. If like after the kidnapping, you just jump backwards in time, it doesn't feel like that would work in a movie. Maybe they could, but I feel like you have to do something else. Not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised when I reread the article that I sent you talking about how this is going to be made into a film. And for some reason, I just assumed this was going to be like a short, like indie film, like a Netflix thing, like shorter, like a different format, because it is such a short, compact story. And I felt the same way about like, how big do you want this to be versus how true to like this structure, which is like, we're talking about a 3-day time period, It's not like Stephen King's It, where he's like, this happened like 30 years ago, so we should probably go in chronological order. But then I saw that it was like actually going to be released in theaters, which means it's probably going to be at least 90 minutes. But what else do you like about this? I just like that, like, this is a good example of a character that's disoriented too, but we know as much as the character knows. We still, as the reader, like have a firm understanding of like what's physically happening to his body. So when it says things like they shoved him down a coal shaft, like he's not in a coal shaft. He's like in the van. He's like traveling to the other place. And then he's like in a basement, but like we get what it feels like to him when he's like sprayed in the face with a wasp spray. He doesn't necessarily even know in the moment it's wasp spray. He's just like reeling in pain, but like we feel the pain. We understand that. So he's disoriented, but like we can still understand that he was sprayed with something and that did this. And it's hard to articulate why it's done well, but it's done well because a lot of times when a character is disoriented in a story, the reader gets disoriented. And it's because the writer is trying to convey that feeling to you. I don't want to feel disoriented. Like I want to know what's happening, but I don't want to like read this stuff and be like, wait, what? Like, did he just get like thrown into what's happening? Like there's enough here that I can like picture the scene still. Obviously there's stories where you are disoriented completely and it still somehow works. But here, I think that's not the point. You're not supposed to be like wondering what's happening. You're supposed to be like, flipping the pages, hoping that he kills this clown. My only takeaway is that something that I've said a million times, which is I just really like the way this is broken up with those numbers. And I think it does like just help you. It helps you as the reader to say like, I'm going to do this in this section now. And I've done that for longer short stories. So like there would be on my end some storyboarding for sure to help me like, transition. Because it's so hard to think of a story that's long, that is that long where there's likely some time passing. There's like some scenes and some moments, maybe some flashbacks. So when you think about when you have to do that, to like just kind of give yourself permission to say like, this section is going to be this section, like I have to do that when I'm doing longer stories. And then when you actually like do the numbers, then you don't even have to like transition between the sections. Like there's obviously transitions happening here, but they're not these written transitions, right? Like you're signaling to the reader that we're done with this scene. You're giving an indication that you're still in the present moment, but 5 minutes has passed, whatever. It's still cohesive. It's not like you're jumping around going nuts. But I just like that structure in terms of writing your story that way, whether or not you like keep the numbers or whatever, but it helps me to conceive of it. Do you have a takeaway?
Yeah. Well, my takeaway was basically, so I wouldn't think of this as being he's not like some amazing stylist or anything like that. The writing is very good though. My takeaway from this is just to like look at the different, he does like on every page, he does like some other move that you don't even notice, right?
Yeah.
But he's a good writer, so he has this like toolbox of moves.
Repertoire, yeah.
Yeah. So I already mentioned like the one where it's like the textual equivalent of a jump scare, right?
Yes.
The little foreshadowing of menace thing that I mentioned before is another one. There's when he and this is something like everyone does this, but it's something to notice is like after he gets sprayed in the eyes, he screamed and took some in the mouth, tasted something harsh and chemical. His eyes were coals cooking in their sockets. That's like an explicit metaphor.
Yeah.
He didn't say his eyes felt like coals,
right?
As if they were cooking in his sockets or something like squirrely like that. It's just goes straight to the image. His eyes were coals. You could go through this and find all those little things. I mean, just talk about the structure, how it's like inciting incident, background, back to the drama.
Right.
And this other part, like he's in the room and he's trying to like get the layout as it is. And he talked about to his right, midway down the room was a black box or cabinet bolted to the wall. At first, he couldn't recognize it for what it was, not because of his unclear vision, but because it was so out of place. A thing that didn't belong in a prison cell. It's not naming what it is, but the first words, the next paragraph is a phone, a large, old-fashioned black phone, a receiver hanging from a silver cradle on the side. That's something to, like you were talking about whether or not he was disoriented versus us being disoriented. This is a way where we're not confused by what's going on, but we're still tracking his like the path of his thoughts as they take in what's around him.
Because I mean, like that's the only way that we can do it in fiction, right?
Yeah.
Like what they'll do in the film is going to be totally different. They're going to like show you the phone.
Yes.
And you're going to be like, is that a phone? Yeah, but here it's like you have to walk us through that.
Yeah. A similar thing, but it's done in a different way, is when he's trying to measure what other people are doing, like the search for him now that he's been kidnapped. Yeah. And he said when he tried to picture the search, he didn't visualize his weeping mother answering a detective's questions in her kitchen. And he didn't see his father out in front of Poole's Hardware, turning away from the sight of a policeman carrying an empty bottle of grape soda in an evidence bag. This is reminiscent of Bullet in the Brain, where he didn't think about this, he didn't think about that. And the next paragraph is, instead, he imagined Susanna standing on the pedals of her 10-speed and gliding down the center of one ride. So he's thinking of his sister. And, when you're writing, you can kind of set up, like you can describe something by saying what it's not, right?
Yeah.
Which you can't do in film. It's not like you can show a picture of an elephant and be like, this is not a rhinoceros.
Right.
I don't know how you do that. But by doing that, you're establishing a mood. You're kind of suggesting things that he's not thinking about, but in some way that they actually happened, right?
Right.
Like his father turning away from the sight of the policeman with the grape soda bottle.
Right.
Yeah. So that's my takeaway is basically you can go through this prose, and even though it's not some amazing stylist that you want to copy all the metaphors and way of seeing the world, there's so many things to learn just by breaking down the prose like that. Little tricks, little tools.
Which he learned from his father. So.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. And he probably reads as much of it as his dad does too. So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, if my dad was Stephen King, I would like purposely not read his shit.
But even if you don't read his stuff, Stephen King reads all the time. Everything he can get his hands on. So that there are piles and piles of books around the house as he's growing up. He's going to be able to
yeah. Very literary family. Oh, the only other thing I'll mention is that apparently this was based on a basement that they had growing up.
Oh, that's right. It was in that article.
Yeah, it was in that article. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.